Tonight, we dive into the escalating US-Iran tensions. Could diplomacy fail and lead to action? I'm your host, breaking it down fact by fact. Uranium enrichment has reached 60%, far exceeding the 2060, weighing its options. Tensions between the US and Iran are rising, with possible action on the horizon. It started with the 2015 JCPOA nuclear deal limited for sanctions, until President Trump withdrew in 2018. Rising tensions with Iran are challenging US foreign policy. Iran is enriching uranium beyond limits, nearing weapons grade by 2025. Amid protests and economic strain, possible US action is under discussion. US-Iran tensions are escalating, yet the risk of conflict grows. Fast forward to 2026, President Trump's second term ramps up pressure with a massive US military buildup, the largest since 2003. Indirect negotiations resumed in January, mediated by Oman, focusing on Iran's nuclear ambitions and US demands. With rising tensions, possible US actions are being considered to counter Iran's nuclear program. Rising tensions define US-Iran relations as talks resume. Key players Trump and Wittkos and Iran's Araghchi meet in Geneva today for the third round, amid threats and sanctions. The US insists on zero uranium enrichment, plus limits on missiles and proxy support. This deadlock heightens the risk of conflict, as both sides signal a willingness to escalate. Tensions between the US and Iran are escalating. A key point of contention is Iran's nuclear program. In exchange, Iran demands full sanctions relief and recognition of its enrichment rights. Rising tensions between the US and Iran have reached a critical point, with possible US action on the horizon. Stamp conducted live foreign. This could trigger a broader US response. On February 19th, President Trump issued a stark 10-15-day ultimatum to Iran. The warning echoed in the risks of conflict in the Persian Gulf. Analysts warn this could spike oil prices and destabilize the region. New US sanctions hit Iran's oil trade just before talks, pressuring Tehran. This chart shows the impact. Exports have plummeted since 2020. Meanwhile, protests are reigniting in Iran. The situation is escalating. Tensions between the US and Iran are rising. A major point of contention, Iran's regional influence. The US demands action against groups like Hezbollah and the Houthis, focusing only on its nuclear program. Tensions with Iran are rising as the US deploys military assets to the region. US deploys carriers, fighters, and destroyers. Officials say it's to deter, but allies warn citizens to leave Iran. Rising tensions in US foreign policy and Iran talks. This buildup includes dozens of jets near Iran, raising fears of strikes if talks collapse. Reports suggest a possible interim nuclear agreement, but Iran rejects it, seeking swift, comprehensive relief. This has raised tensions, and the US is considering stronger action if diplomacy fails. Iran's supreme leader threatens to sink US warships, escalating tensions amid military drills. This rhetoric comes as both nations conduct civil actions include increased patrols or diplomatic pressure. Tensions between the US and Iran are escalating, with new talks on the horizon. A recent poll shows 48% of Americans view Iran as an enemy, concerned about nukes, but wary of military action. Rising tensions define the US-Iran talks, with diplomacy at a crossroads. Nuclear activities are escalating, pressuring US airstrikes on nuclear sites to pressures for nation sources. US-Iran tensions are rising as talks falter, raising the risk of conflict. Options include cyber operations or targeting leadership, aiming to avoid full war. Tensions are rising as US and Iran talks stall. The Strait of Hormuz remains a critical flashpoint. A conflict could spike oil prices, disrupt global trade, hitting US consumers hard. Allies Saudi Arabia urges action. Israel pushes for a broader deal including missiles. Israel wants a wider agreement to curb Iran's missile program. This shapes US policy. Tensions are rising between the US and Iran. What are the stakes? Russia and China back Iran with joint exercises, complicating US strategy. This strains talks and impacts global oil prices. The US considers action. Rising tensions define US-Iran relations, with the Trump stated he will never allow Iran a nuclear weapon. The sanctions are tightening. What action comes next? Tensions are rising in the US-Iran nuclear talks. A key chart shows their red lines. US demands no enrichment, Iran wants sanctions lifted. Bridging this gap is key to avoiding further escalation. Protests in Iran. Anti-government unrest continues to weaken Tehran's position. This pressure could force concessions in the nuclear talks with the US. Data shows rising protest intensity may push Tehran toward compromise. Tensions between the US and Iran are rising, with talks at a critical juncture. Iran's uranium stockpile is now enough for potential weapons, per the IAEA. This heightens the urgency, as US action is being considered. Rising tensions between the US and Iran have reached a critical point. Today's Geneva session is mediated by Oman, focusing on win-win elements for a diplomatic resolution. Rising tensions mark the US-Iran nuclear talks as a deal remains elusive. Escalation risks are high. If talks fail, a limited US strike could trigger Iranian retaliation on bases or ships. Peace through strength. Trump's policy builds up forces for leverage. But officials say war is not inevitable. The US has increased military spending, and Iran continues its still the preferred path. Tensions between the US and Iran are rising. Possible actions are being weighed. Historical parallels show echoes of future lines buildup, but today the focus is on deterrence, not invasion. The stakes are high. Tensions are rising. Countries are urging their citizens to leave Iran. This warning underscores fears of a potential strike with tensions at a peak. We examine the U.S. response and what this means for global stability. U.S.-Iran nuclear talks face rising tensions, with diplomacy at a critical juncture. Analyst says diplomacy is the only way, but they're ready to defend if attacked. The stakes for global security are high. Rising tensions between the U.S. and Iran have reached a critical point. Closing could halt 20% of global oil, devastating economies. This leaves the U.S. weighing possible action to keep oil flowing. Leaked documents reveal U.S. options on Iran. The New York Times reports Trump leans toward a limited strike for pressure. This could escalate tensions in the Strait of Hormuz, threatening global oil supplies. Rising tensions between the U.S. and Iran threaten to derail nuclear talks. This chart shows Iran's extensive proxy conflicts in the region. The U.S. seeks to address Iran's axis of resistance in any deal. Rising tensions in U.S.-Iran talks raise the specter of conflict. Diplomatic off-ramps exist, but time is short. Experts outline sequential threats, from degradation to control escalation. What action will the U.S. take? Tensions between the U.S. and Iran are rising. With IRGC forces on alert, the U.S. is monitoring drills closely. This report examines military readiness and possible U.S. actions. Global stakes. A deal could stabilize the region. Failure risks a wider conflict. With talks at a critical point, oil prices are rising 15%. The world is watching. U.S.-Iran tensions are escalating as Washington considers new actions. This map shows U.S. allies in the region bracing for impact. Gulf states coordinates U.S. will explore the possible outcomes. Rising U.S.-Iran tensions have sparked public doubt. Polls show Americans fear nuclear threats but question the use of force. This gap between fear and trust raises key questions about America's next move. Rising tensions between the U.S. and Iran have global implications. Talks from Oman to Geneva show slow but ongoing progress. The U.S. is weighing possible actions if diplomacy stalls. Iran's counterproposal is a critical development. Tehran offers token enrichment, a gesture now under review in Washington. This move could ease or escalate tensions in the Middle East, where military buildups raise the stakes. Tensions between the U.S. and Iran are escalating. With U.S. deploying massive military in the region, dozens of jets and counter-resistance engineers. Analysts warn this scale of mobilization signals potential U.S. action. Tensions between the U.S. and Iran are escalating. Sanctions are key to forcing concessions. This strategy applies pressure before military options. The goal is negotiation, not conflict. Rising tensions between the U.S. and Iran demand attention. Possible actions include cyber strikes or a blockade, each with risks. We must consider the potential for escalation and diplomatic fallout. Hope for a deal. Officials say both sides seek a win-win to avert war. Tensions are rising, with oil prices surging and military buildups in the region. The U.S. warns of action if diplomacy fails, as the world watches. Tensions are rising in U.S.-Iran nuclear talks, with possible American action on the horizon. For Americans, this could mean higher gas prices and security concerns if the situation escalates. We'll break down the latest developments. Tensions are rising as U.S. and Iran talks unfold. The U.S. is weighing military options with 45% public support. As talks unfold, the world watches. Will diplomacy prevail? Stay informed.